In June 1950, Dr. Enrique Botta became involved in a UFO encounter that still baffles investigators. The sun was beginning to set over the horizon in Venezuela, casting long shadows across the dusty road that Dr. Botta drove along, returning to Caracas from a routine consulting job at an airport construction site. He was a man of logic and precision, his background in aeronautical engineering sharpening his mind to quickly analyze, understand, and explain the world around him. That evening in June 1950, however, the world would present him with something beyond reason, beyond explanation. This encounter would redefine his view of reality and plunge him into a decades-long search for answers. It all started innocently enough, with the hum of the car engine and the sun's orange glow fading behind the hills. Then, out of nowhere, Botta noticed something unusual, a column of smoke rising in the distance. It was a peculiar sight, especially in such a remote area, and his first instinct was that it must be the aftermath of a plane crash. He immediately slowed the car and turned toward the smoke, feeling an instinctual sense of duty as an engineer to investigate. As he approached the source of the smoke, he noticed that it wasn't just smoke at all. The ground around the site was scorched, and at the center of the devastation lay an object unlike anything he had ever seen. His first thought was that it might be an experimental aircraft, some kind of prototype undergoing testing. But as he moved closer, his instinct screamed otherwise. This was no ordinary plane. The craft was shaped like a disc, approximately 30 feet in diameter, with a metallic sheen that reflected the sun's dying light. Its surface seemed to shimmer, not from heat but as if the air around it were electrified. The soft hum emanating from the object made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was then that he realized this was something entirely different. Dr. Botta paused, his breath catching in his throat. The object seemed both familiar and utterly foreign. For a man who had spent his life around aircraft, served during World War II, and had a deep understanding of machinery, the sight before him was incomprehensible. But his curiosity overpowered his fear. The air felt thick and static as Botta cautiously approached the craft. The closer he got, the more he noticed the distinct scent of ozone hanging in the air, a scent he would later describe as being akin to an electrical storm. The temperature dropped suddenly, sending a chill through his body despite the warmth of the Venezuelan summer evening. When he got within a few feet of the object, he saw them, three beings inside the craft. The interior was dimly lit, but there was no mistaking their presence. The figures, humanoid in shape, were slumped over in their seats, motionless. They were, unlike anything he had ever seen before, gray-skinned, with long, slender limbs, large and bulbous heads with no visible mouths or noses. Their eyes were large and dark, and their bodies were covered in what looked like tight-fitting metallic suits. Botta's heart raced. Were they dead? Were they injured? He didn't know what to do. His first instinct was to help, but how? What were they? What kind of ship was this? He reached out to touch the hull of the craft, but as his hand neared the surface, a jolt of electricity surged through him, forcing him to recoil. It was as if the craft was surrounded by an invisible energy field. For a long moment, Botta stood there, frozen in place, his mind racing. The logical part of him wanted to analyze, to understand, to find an explanation for what he was seeing. But the primal part of him, the part driven by fear, urged him to run, to get as far away from this strange, otherworldly scene as possible. At that moment, the craft began to hum louder, and the air seemed to vibrate with energy. The beings inside did not move, but Botta felt an overwhelming sense that he was being watched not by the creatures inside the ship but by the ship itself. Desperate to document what he saw, he scrambled back to his car to grab his camera. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the equipment, snapping several pictures of the craft and its occupants. As he did so, the hum of the ship grew louder, almost as if it were alive, responding to his presence. The light around the craft began to shift, growing brighter, almost blinding. Suddenly, the air around him seemed to constrict, and he found breathing difficult. His heart pounded in his chest as a sharp pain shot through his head, forcing him to drop the camera. He staggered backward, clutching his temples as the world around him spun. His vision blurred, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he might pass out. But just as quickly as the pain had come, it was gone. The hum of the craft quieted, and the light dimmed. The air was still once again. Botta glanced back at the ship, gasping for breath, but the beings inside remained unmoving. He knew he couldn't stay any longer. Whatever this was, it wasn't safe. Dr. Botta drove back to Caracas in a daze, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The logical part of his brain insisted that there had to be an explanation. Perhaps it was some kind of experimental aircraft, a secret project that had gone wrong. But the other part of him, the part that had felt the energy, seen the beings, and experienced the physical effects of the craft, knew that what he had encountered was beyond anything humanity had ever created. When he arrived back in Caracas, he developed the photos he had taken, desperate for proof, for something tangible to validate his experience. But when the images returned, they were overexposed, washed out, and blurry, as if the camera itself had been affected by the strange energy surrounding the craft. The beings, the craft, everything he had seen was barely discernible in the photos. It was as if the ship had erased itself from the film, leaving behind only vague shadows of what had once been. Frustrated and shaken, Botta confided in a few trusted colleagues, men he knew from his work in aeronautical engineering. But the reactions were not what he had hoped for. Some dismissed his story outright, suggesting that he had suffered from some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue or stress. Others were more intrigued but ultimately skeptical. There was no way to prove what he had seen without solid evidence. Botta became consumed by the incident in the weeks and months that followed. He spent countless hours researching UFO sightings, poring over government reports, and talking to anyone who had experienced something similar. He reached out to experts in the field, hoping to find answers, but the more he learned, the more questions he had. What had he seen? Where had the craft come from? Who were the beings inside, and what were they doing in the skies over Venezuela? The encounter changed Dr. Botta in ways he never could have anticipated. A man of science and logic, he grappled with ideas that defied explanation. The experience had opened his eyes to the possibility that humanity was not alone in the universe, that there were other beings, other civilizations, out there, watching, perhaps even interacting with us. But as much as the incident had expanded his worldview, it had also isolated him. His once close relationships with colleagues and friends became strained, as many of them could not reconcile the logical, level-headed man they had known with the story he now told. He became more reclusive, spending long hours alone in his study, piecing together fragments of information, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. Despite the lack of concrete proof, Botta remained convinced of the reality of what he had seen. He continued to speak about his experience at conferences and lectures, hoping that others might come forward with their own stories. He became a quiet figure in the growing field of UFO research, respected by some, ridiculed by others, but always driven by the pursuit of truth. In the following decades, Dr. Botta's encounter became one of many UFO stories that would weave into 20th century history. The incident in Venezuela, though lesser known than others, was a significant chapter in the broader narrative of humanity's ongoing fascination with the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Dr. Botta's encounter isn't the only one. Here are two others to make you wonder, are we alone? Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more.